The message arrived at 0314 station time, threading through the Verith Citadel's outer reception array on a frequency band that no human facility had used in over 100 millennia. Our comm team flagged it inside 11 seconds. My personal terminal lit at 0317. By 0319, I was dressed, standing at the long window of my quarters on the Citadel's 43rd tier, looking south across the greater Verith sprawl with a mug going cold in my hand, reading the transmission header for the 4th time. Originating authority, Sora Compact Enforcement Directorate, 4th Compliance Fleet. The body of the message was brief. It announced, in a formal register that had not been current in any living diplomatic tradition for longer than our written history, that the Sora Compact's Enforcement Directorate was completing approach to the Sol system under standing authority of the Verith Accord of Binding, Instrument Number 7 Theta Sora 4, dated to a calendar epoch corresponding, by our reckoning, to approximately 120,000 years before that morning. It stated that the 4th Compliance Fleet had arrived to assess Earth's obligations under Article 9 of the Accord, which required periodic tribute, population census, and submission of a resource yield report to compact receivers. It invited the world's designated compliance officer, a title that had not existed in human governance for so long that it predated agriculture, which itself predated much of what we now call ancient history, to present themselves within 48 hours at a location of the compacts, choosing in low orbit. I read it once more. Then I set the mug on the sill, watched the orbital ring catch the last of the nighttime glow across the southern sky, and called Director Fenwick. Fenwick was head of the Treaty Bureau, a division of the Threshold Commission that most people in government had never had occasion to interact with directly. They knew it existed in the way that people know certain departments of a very large institution exist, through organizational charts, through budget line items, through the occasional ceremonial reference at commission-wide addresses that always moved briskly past the Bureau's entry in the roll. The Bureau occupied 6 sublevels of the Citadel's eastern wing and maintained, in climate-controlled archival stacks that stretched for half a kilometer beneath the plateau bedrock, the complete documentary record of every treaty, accord, covenant, and instrument of binding that Earth had ever been party to, including the ones we had been made party to without our knowledge or consent, including the ones no living human had a practical reason to think about. The Bureau was the Commission's long memory, the part of the institution that existed not for the present administration, but for the moments that history had not yet delivered. Fenwick had held his post for 19 years. He was 63 years old, unhurried in conversation, methodical in procedure, and constitutionally incapable of treating any question about the treaty record as too obscure to deserve a thorough answer. He had come to the Bureau from the Subcommission's Legacy Instruments Division, where I had spent 11 years before my own appointment as envoy, and we shared the professional formation of people who have spent careers working on problems that most of their colleagues consider long settled. He was the 12th head of the Bureau in an unbroken chain of succession going back 900 years, to the moment the Bureau's founders had decided, without fanfare and without any certainty of vindication in their own lifetimes, that this day would eventually come. He answered on the second chime. He had already read the transmission. "The accord number matches," he said. His voice was level. He might have been confirming a filing reference. "I know," I said. "How long has the Bureau been holding the response?" "The current draft has been in final form for 61 years," he said. The foundational arguments go back to the Bureau's founding, 9 centuries of preparation, envoy Solveig. We knew the orbital period within a range of decades. We have used the time accordingly. I stood at the window a moment longer. The orbital ring was visible from the Citadel's upper tiers on clear nights as a pale arc, not a line so much as a presence, the sense of something vast and continuous overhead. A structure so large that at altitude it reads not as a built thing, but as a feature of the sky. It carries its cargo of stations and defense arrays. and the quiet infrastructure of a civilization that has spent a very long time learning, carefully and at considerable cost, what it means to be left alone in a galaxy that sometimes comes back to check on things it once left behind. In the middle distance, the greater Vareth sprawl extended to the horizon in tiers of light and layered structure, the mega buildings of the central district throwing their own skylines against the night, each one representing a density of population and purpose that would have been incomprehensible to the people who had signed the Accord's predecessor, instruments under duress 120,000 years before that morning. 2 warships were visible over the northern quarter, hanging in atmosphere at 60 kilometers altitude, their running lights steady and unhurried. They had been repositioned there 2 days ago, when our long-range watch had first confirmed the compact's transit signature entering the outer system. Not scrambled, repositioned. The distinction matters. Scrambling speaks of alarm and improvisation. Repositioning speaks of a protocol that was ready before the alarm arrived. I will need the full package on my desk by 0600, I said. It will be there 053, Fenwick said. And I heard in the even precision of his answer the quality of a man who has been waiting 61 years for this particular morning. I set the mug down and went to work. I want to say something about the quality of those hours before dawn, because they were not what I expected them to be. I had known for 7 years that this day would come. The Bureau had told me so in my first formal briefing after my appointment as envoy, the session where Fenwick had laid the Accord file on the table and walked me through it with the methodical patience he brought to every document in his care. I had read the condensed version then, and I had read it again at each annual review, and I had participated in 2 full-scale readiness exercises in which the Commission's response protocols were tested against simulated scenarios, modeled on the Compact's expected approach. I had done the work of preparation that the role required, and yet, sitting in the briefing room at 0430 with the condensed package open to the 3rd pillar, the Article 22 dissolution instrument, the 14 witnesses, the 3 archival deposits, I was aware of something that the exercises had not been able to simulate: the weight of all the people who had built this. The 14 witnesses, all of them now gone, who had gathered 9 centuries ago to put their certifications on a document that would sit in 3 archives for 900 years before it was ever tested. The 12 bureau directors in succession, each of whom had received the file and spent years refining it before passing it to the next. The founders themselves, whoever they were, who had made a decision in some ordinary institutional setting that the Bureau should exist, that the Accord should be treated as a live instrument, that humanity should not allow itself to be taken by surprise by its own history. I am a diplomat by training and disposition. I do not often think in terms of debt. But sitting in that briefing room in the hours before dawn with the Compact's fleet in orbit above me, and 9 centuries of preparation in the document under my hands, I thought about debt, not abstractly, with the specific, grounded weight of a person who is about to walk into a room and speak on behalf of everyone in that chain, everyone who did the work without knowing whether it would be needed, everyone who passed the file forward because they believed it was worth passing, and whose answer to the question of whether it mattered will be answered in a few hours in a reception chamber 4,000 meters above the plateau floor. Not the debt the Accord described, the resource yields and population census extractions and tribute obligations. The other debt, the one I owed to the people who had done this work for the morning, when someone would need to walk into a room and deliver it. The work had been done before I was born, extended and refined by people who would not live to see it used, held and maintained across a chain of institutional succession that no single person in the chain could have sustained alone. My job, on the morning ahead, was not to be brilliant. It was to be worthy of what had been prepared for me. I finished reading at 0547 and sat for a few minutes with the package closed, watching the sprawl wake up through the southern windows. Then I called the commission chair. The Treaty Bureau's response package ran to 412 pages in its condensed form, with 11,000 pages of supporting documentation indexed behind it. I read the condensed form twice before dawn. I had been envoy to the Threshold Commission for 7 years, and before that I had spent 11 years in the subcommission offices dealing with what we called legacy instruments, old agreements, expired covenants, the scattered diplomatic debris of humanity's long and complicated history, with species who had passed through the Sol system across the centuries. I was not unfamiliar with this file. The Bureau had briefed every sitting envoy on it as a matter of standing protocol. But there is a meaningful difference between reading a briefing about a contingency and reading the same document with the contingency already in system and decelerating into geosynchronous orbit above your head. I read slowly and with care because the material deserved that, and because the morning ahead would require that I know it as well as Fenwick did. Not as well in the technical legal sense, because that was his domain and his 9 centuries of accumulated institutional preparation, but well enough to speak to it without notes in a room where the other party was watching every word for the angle they could use. The first thing to understand about the Verith Accord of Binding was that it was real. This is worth stating plainly, because the temptation, in the abstract, is to treat a 120,000-year-old treaty as historical artifact rather than live legal instrument. It had been both for a very long time, but it was the second before the first, and the Bureau had never allowed itself to treat it otherwise. It was a genuine instrument executed under genuine duress by representatives of early Homo sapiens in an era when the Sora Compact maintained active operations in this arm of the galaxy and Earth was, by any honest accounting, a resource world, a biological inventory, a site visited on a long orbital schedule to extract what was useful and administer what remained. The Accord obligated Earth to yield census data, population inventories, resource outputs, and periodic tribute on the schedule the Compact's fleet maintained. It was, in the vocabulary of the era that produced it, a standard compliance framework for a low-development world inside compact territorial reach. The kind of document powerful institutions write when the other party lacks standing to negotiate and the draftsmen see no particular reason to be careful about the future. That was the second thing to understand. The Compact had written this treaty the way a landlord writes a lease for a property they do not expect to think about again. They had not anticipated that the tenant would still be here, in a form worth negotiating with, when the lease came up for review 120 millennia later. They had certainly not anticipated that the tenant would have read every word of the lease with the close attention of people who understood that their future might depend on it. The Bureau's countercase rested on 4 pillars, each developed and refined across 9 centuries of careful, unglamorous legal work by people who would never see the argument delivered in a room where it counted. The first was Article 14 of the Accord itself, buried in the instrument's administrative provisions, in the compliance scheduling section, 3/4 of the way through a document that most readers would never reach that far. It stated that all compliance obligations were conditional on the Compact, maintaining active representation within 2 light years of the subject world without interruption exceeding 1 standard orbital cycle of that world's primary star. The Compact had vacated this arm of the galaxy 119,000 years ago. Their departure had not been announced, had included no formal notification to the subject worlds on their compliance roster, and had apparently been driven by pressures elsewhere in their sphere that the Bureau's historians had spent centuries piecing together from fragmentary sources across a dozen archives. The Compact had simply gone. By the Accord's own terms, the compliance clock had stopped within approximately 1 century of their departure, when the absence exceeded the Article 14 threshold. The obligations had ceased to be binding at that point, not because we had declared them ceased, because the instrument said so, In language, the compact's own drafters had written in a provision they had included for administrative tidiness, and not because they expected it to be invoked. The second pillar was jurisdictional succession. The Sora Compact as currently constituted was not, by any continuous legal standard the Bureau could identify, the same institutional entity as the compact that had drafted and executed the accord in 20,000 BCE. The Bureau's historians had documented, across 17 independent off-world archival sources, including 3 maintained by Compact, member species, 11 internal reorganizations of the Compact's governing structure over the intervening millennia, 3 complete dissolution and reconstitution events in which the body had formally ceased to exist under its own charter and then reformed under new instruments that claimed but did not legally establish succession, and 2 extended periods of total operational dormancy during which no functions had been carried out in the Compact's name at all. The Bureau argued, in documents deposited in 7 off-world archives accessible to any inquiring party, available for review by the Compact's own legal scholars, had they ever thought to look, that institutional continuity sufficient to inherit treaty rights required unbroken legal succession. The Compact's own charter documents, copies of which the Bureau had obtained through the Marin Confluence's historical holdings, did not establish that succession. They established a new institution that had claimed an old institution's name and some of its traditions. That is a different thing from being that institution. The third pillar was the termination clause. Article 22 provided for automatic instrument dissolution upon demonstrated attainment by the subject world of what the drafters had called primary force equivalence with the relevant tier of compact enforcement capability. The Bureau's linguists had spent decades ensuring the rendering from the Accord's original legal register was precise, that no interpretive ambiguity remained. Article 22 had been included because the Accord's drafters were being thorough. The way careful, contract writers include provisions for events they consider impossible, as formal acknowledgments of theoretical possibilities. In 120,000 BCE, the gap between a compact enforcement wing and whatever humanity could muster was not a gap that closed in any foreseeable time frame. By the time the clause had become something other than theoretical, by the Bureau's careful historical estimate, somewhere between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago, when humanity's expanding infrastructure first crossed the threshold the article described, there had been no compact representative in the region to invoke it, so the Bureau had invoked it unilaterally. 912 years ago, Director Orvid, the third head of the Bureau, had executed a formal instrument of self-dissolution under Article 22, witnessed by representatives of 14 spacefaring species with recognized standing in interspecies treaty law, and deposited certified copies in 3 separate off-world archival systems chosen for their independence from Earth and their institutional longevity. The dissolution had been in the record for nearly a millennium. It required no action on the Compact's part to be effective. It was effective because the article said it would be, given the preconditions, and the preconditions had been met and documented and witnessed and deposited in archives that predated the Bureau itself. The fourth pillar was the one that had taken me the longest to read both times through. It was not a legal argument. It was a historical accounting. 3,000 pages of sourced, cross-referenced documentation of what the Sora Compact's periodic compliance visits had actually taken from Earth during the centuries the Accord had been in active force, population census extractions, and the uses to which they had been put, biological harvest records and their yields, resource extraction figures by category and by compliance visit cycle. The documentation was necessarily incomplete at that distance in time. We could not recover what no archive had preserved, but what had survived. 9 centuries of archival work was sufficient to constitute a record, not compiled to support a legal claim, not compiled to demand a specific remedy, compiled because the Bureau's founders had decided at the institution's founding that the record of what had been taken was part of the record, so that when this day came and the Compact's delegates sat across a table from the Commission's envoy, they would understand that we had not forgotten, not the numbers, not the processes, not what the Accord's enforcement had meant in practice for the people against whom it had been enforced. I finished reading at 0547. I sat in the briefing room with the condensed package closed on the table and the sprawl beginning to warm in the early gray light. I thought about what it meant to have 9 centuries of answer waiting in a sealed file on the morning the answer was needed. I thought about the people who had built the file, generation after generation, most of them working toward a day they expected never to see. Then I called the commission chair and requested authorization to proceed as lead envoy. He gave it at 0612. The Compact's fleet numbered 11 vessels. Our long-range sensor packages had been characterizing them for 18 hours as the 4th compliance. Fleet decelerated into high orbit, 7 enforcement carriers of a mid-period compact design, 2 dedicated signals vessels, 1 archival ship, which we interpreted as their having brought their own copy of the treaty and their own legal function, and 1 vessel of a configuration we had not previously catalogued, which the Defense Directorate classified as a mobile command platform. They were not small ships. The largest enforcement carrier ran to nearly 4 kilometers in length. They were formidably armed by the standards of the era that had built them, powerful enough to have been genuinely dangerous to anything humanity could have produced 40 or 50,000 years ago. They moved with the confidence of a body that had not, in its institutional experience, encountered meaningful resistance when deploying a compliance fleet to a client world. What they saw when they achieved geosynchronous orbit over the Vareth Plateau region, I can only partly reconstruct from the intercepts our arrays captured of their internal communications in the hours following orbital insertion. What I know with certainty is that they went quiet for 11 minutes after their first full sensor sweep of the surface. 11 minutes is a long time for a fleet in contact protocol over a world it has come to administer. In that interval, properly prepared, you form an initial assessment, consult internally, draft a revised position, and begin composing a response. In 11 minutes. Arriving without adequate preparation, you look at what you are looking at and reach for a framework that fits it, and fail to find one, and start the reaching again. Our signals team read the silence as recalibration. I think that is the right word. Not shock, which implies disruption of function. Recalibration. The systematic revision of every operating assumption that governed the approach to this system. The orbital ring alone would have required significant recalibration. At 300 kilometers altitude, it encircles Earth continuously, a built feature so large that at range it registers on gravimetric sensors before optical ones. Its distributed mass equivalent to a modest moon disassembled and restructured into a permanent equatorial feature. It is not primarily a weapons platform. It is infrastructure, power relay, manufacturing capacity, transit network, communications backbone, distributed defense coordination. But its scale registers before its function does, and scale is the first language in which the powerful read one another. You see a structure like the orbital ring and you know, before you have assessed any technical specification, that the civilization which built it is not a civilization that can be administered by 11 enforcement carriers on a compliance run. Behind the ring, spaced through geosynchronous positions around the equatorial band, sat 7 of the Meridian defense stations. Each one is roughly the scale of a modest moon. Each was built over centuries, crewed and maintained and upgraded across generations of engineers, none of whom saw the project begin, and many of whom did not see it end. Their weapons specifications are not part of this account. What is part of this account is that they are not hidden. They have never been hidden. They sit in open orbit, visible to any sensor system capable of basic astronomical observation, because concealment was never the intention. The defense stations were not built to surprise. They were built to be there, unmistakably, permanently, when someone came looking, so that the first thing a returning fleet understood upon arriving in this system was that it had arrived in a system prepared for exactly that possibility. In atmosphere over the greater Vareth region, the home fleet held a patrol formation, 12 warships, the smallest at 800 meters, the largest at just over 6 kilometers. A loose, unhurried circuit in our own atmosphere, treating the compact's presence in orbit above with the steady awareness of something settled in its own territory. They had been repositioned to that circuit 2 days before, when long-range watch confirmed the compact's transit signature. Not scrambled. The protocol had been written 9 centuries ago, and the protocol said to reposition. In the 18 hours between the compact's first orbital insertion and their eventual request for surface contact, our signals team compiled an extensive record of their internal communications. I have read the translated summaries. They are the record of a command structure engaged in the same process I had watched through my office window. Recalibration, the revision of assumptions, the careful managed admission that the world below did not match the operational profile, senior officers reviewing sensor data, legal staff consulting the archived treaty text, someone, we believe the command platform's senior analyst, composing a memorandum to the compliance directorate in which the phrase "without" precedent appears 3 times in 4 pages. The communications directorate taking 40 minutes to draft a single response to our arrival, acknowledgement, while in the ordinary course of their operations, they turned communications in under 10. When the response came, the compliance visit framing of their initial transmission had been quietly set aside, replaced with a request to establish diplomatic contact at the surface level. At the Commission's discretion, we acknowledged and confirmed within the hour. They sent 4 delegates to the surface. The choice to come down to us rather than summon us to orbit was a concession they did not, I think, fully register making. A compliance visit, under the Accord's terms, would have summoned the subject world's compliance officer up to orbit. By coming to us, they were already adjusting their posture away from the instrument's framework and towards something closer to a standard diplomatic visit between parties of equivalent standing. The adjustment was not sufficient, but it was noted, and I made a point of neither acknowledging it nor pressing on it. When a party begins voluntarily revising its posture, the correct response is to give them space to keep revising. I met them in the Vareth Citadel's primary reception chamber. The citadel is built into the eastern face of the Meridian Plateau continental arch, a structure of human construction so large that its base spans a former ocean shelf, its upper tiers extending above the permanent weather layer, and its total surface area, seen from orbital altitude, resembling less a building than a continental feature that happens to have windows. The arch was not built as a monument. It was built as infrastructure. People live in it the way people live in a city, without particularly thinking about the structure as a structure, because from the inside, it is simply where they are. The reception chamber sits at the arch's mid-level, roughly 4,000 meters above the plateau floor, with a curved exterior wall of transparent composite, giving an unobstructed view south and east across the greater Vareth sprawl. On a clear morning, and the morning of the compact delegation's arrival was clear, a high-pressure system settled over the plateau region with the indifference that weather has to diplomatic calendars. You could see from that window the orbital ring, the lower defense stations in their geosynchronous positions, 2 of the atmospheric patrol warships in the middle distance, and approximately 60 kilometers of continuous megacity before the atmospheric haze finally swallowed the horizon. I had not chosen the room to intimidate. I had chosen it because the proceeding deserved to happen in a room where the truth of the situation was visible without any additional effort on anyone's part. The compact's 4 delegates arrived by diplomatic shuttle and were escorted to the chamber by the Commission's protocol staff. I was already at the table when they came in, with the Bureau's condensed package in front of me, a second copy ready for their legal attaché, and the full 11,000-page documentation accessible on the archival terminals arrayed behind me. Fenwick sat to my left. He was wearing the Bureau's formal institutional gray, which he wore every working day, whether or not the occasion called for it, and his expression was the settled, attentive patience of a man who has been waiting a very long time for a specific meeting and has no intention of hurrying it now that it has arrived. The lead delegate I had prepared for, from the Bureau's xenological records, saw a lineage primary cast, tall, bilaterally symmetrical, with the heavy orbital ridging their documentation associated with senior enforcement rank, and the particular bearing that in their physical vocabulary indicated institutional authority. His name, rendered into standard, was closest to Verith Instructor Commanding Soten Ral. I registered the coincidence of the Verith designation with our own Citadel's name and proceeded without comment. Behind him stood 2 enforcement analysts, junior ranks, there to observe and document the proceeding for their fleet's record, and a legal attaché carrying a sealed archive case of the type the Bureau's. Records described as standard issue for compact treaty originals. They had brought their copy of the Accord. Of course they had. They had arrived believing this would be a compliance session, and a compliance session requires the instrument. I offered water because hospitality is not a concession, and because I wanted them to have a moment to look at the room without the pressure of an immediate verbal exchange. Soten Ral accepted the water and looked at the room. He looked at it with the attention of a person doing rapid assessment against a set of expectations that the room was not satisfying. His gaze moved from the orbital ring to the defense stations to the warships in atmosphere, tracking the same inventory I had watched many times from this window, but seeing it with the clarity that comes from looking at something for the first time and having no established category to file it in. I watched the inventory register, one element at a time. The way it registers when the arriving party had built their operational plan around a very different picture of the world below. Then he looked at the table, at the document in front of me, and then at me. "You received our instrument notification," he said. His standard was formal and carried a slight archaic coloring that matched precisely what the Bureau's linguists had predicted. "We did," I said. "The Verith Accord of Binding, Instrument 7 Theta Sora 4. We have been expecting your fleet's return." The word expecting did what I had expected it to do. I watched the small stillness move across his face, the adjustment that is required when the party that was supposed to be surprised uses the language of anticipation. "You are familiar with the instrument," he said. "We have maintained a continuous scholarly and legal record of it for 900 years, I said. "The Treaty Bureau's formal work on the Accord predates my appointment, my predecessor's appointment, and the appointments of 10 heads of Bureau before him. The Bureau was founded 9 centuries ago specifically to have a ready answer prepared when your fleet's orbital period brought it back to this system. In those 9 centuries, the Bureau has not been idle." I placed the condensed response package on the table and slid it toward him. He looked at it without touching it for a moment. 412 pages, the commission's seal on the cover, carrying the weight of 9 centuries of preparation in the form of a document that looks, from the outside, like any other administrative file. Then he picked it up and opened it to the first page. "This is the Threshold Commission's formal response to the Accord notification," I said. "It addresses 4 primary grounds for instrument dissolution, each grounded in the Accord's own text and in the body of interspecies treaty law that has developed in this region of the galaxy over the past 100 millennia. Director Fenwick of the Treaty Bureau is available to address technical questions on any of the 4 grounds. I would recommend beginning with Article 14 and Article 22. Fenwick was already at the side door. He came in, set his copy of the full documentation on the table, and took his seat beside me with the unhurried precision of a man who has been waiting 61 years for a particular chair in a particular room and is now sitting in it. Soten Ral read the opening section. His legal attaché moved to his shoulder and read alongside him. The two analysts remained at the room's edge, very still. After 2 full minutes of reading, Soten Ral looked up. "You are claiming dormancy of representation," he said. "Among other grounds," I said. "Article 14 is the most structurally direct. The compact's operational presence within the Accord's specified proximity zone lapsed 119,000 years ago by our best historical documentation of your fleet's departure from this region. The compliance obligations under Article 9 are explicitly conditioned on active compact representation within 2 light years of the subject world, without interruption exceeding 1 standard orbital cycle of Earth's primary star. That precondition ceased to be met within approximately 1 century of your departure. By the Accord's own terms, the obligation ceased at that point, not by our declaration, by the instrument's own language. The compact's absence was circumstantial," he said. "Operational pressures elsewhere in our sphere. The instrument does not recognize circumstantial absence as a dissolution trigger." "Article 14 does not use the word circumstantial," Fenwick said, and his voice carried the same level. Factual tone he used for every conversation about this file, not scoring a point, stating what was in the document. "The provision specifies only the fact of presence and the duration of absence. The reason for absence is not a variable the article addresses. The threshold is 1 orbital cycle. Your absence exceeded that threshold by several orders of magnitude. The dormancy argument is not a position we constructed. It is in your own instrument, in language your own drafters wrote." The legal attaché was working through the document with increasing speed. His hands on the archive case had gone very still against the table. "The second ground concerns institutional succession," Fenwick continued. "The Sora Compact as currently constituted is not, by the continuity standards the instrument's own preamble establishes, the same legal entity as the compact that executed the Accord. We have documented the intervening reorganizations, dissolutions, and reconstitutions at Index 7 of the full package. The documentation is cross-referenced against 17 independent off-world archival sources, including 3 maintained by compact member species. You are welcome to contest our historical record. But the continuity argument ultimately rests on your own charter documents, copies of which we obtained through the Marin Confluence's historical holdings. And those documents do not establish the unbroken legal succession that would be required to inherit the rights of the original instrument." "The third ground," I said, when a pause opened, "is Article 22, the parity clause. I expect your legal attaché will have found it by now." He had found it. The change in the quality of his stillness was visible from across the table. Article 22 of the Accord provided for automatic instrument dissolution upon demonstrated attainment by the subject world of primary force, equivalence with the relevant tier of compact enforcement capability. The Bureau's linguists had spent decades ensuring the rendering was precise. The drafters had written it for an impossibility, the clause of a provision for an event that could not happen. In 120,000 BCE, the gap between a compact enforcement wing and whatever humanity could muster was not a gap that closed. 912 years ago, Director Orvid had executed the dissolution instrument, 14 species witnessing, 3 archives receiving. We executed a formal instrument of self-dissolution under Article 22, Fenwick said, 912 years ago, witnessed by representatives of 14 spacefaring species with recognized standing in interspecies treaty law, names, species designations, and certifications at Index 10. Certified copies deposited in the Keth Continuance Archive, the Voral Ledger at the Periphery Station, and the independent archival holdings of the Marin Confluence. Deposition numbers and current access protocols at Index 11. The dissolution was executed unilaterally because there was no compact representative in this region to co-sign it. But Article 22 does not require co-signature. It requires demonstration of parity and formal execution and archival deposit of the dissolution instrument. Both requirements were met. The dissolution has been legally effective for 912 years. Soten Rall set the condensed package down on the table. He had been holding it throughout the proceeding. An automatic gesture, I thought, the reflex of someone who arrives with an instrument and keeps it in hand as a grounding reference. Setting it down was another adjustment he did not fully register making. His legal attaché was reading the Article 22 section with the focused attention of someone checking their own work against someone else's, better version of the same calculation. His two analysts had not moved since taking their positions at the room's edge. The room had the particular quality of concentrated silence that come when several people who are very good at their work are all doing it, simultaneously without speaking. I have been in diplomatic proceedings that went wrong. I have been in proceedings that collapsed before they properly began, proceedings where the other party's delegation walked out, and proceedings where ours did. Proceedings that resolved into formal impasse, and proceedings that resolved into something worse. I have also been in proceedings that went right, and what has always struck me about the ones that went right, genuinely right, not merely to our advantage in a way that stored up problems for later, is that they tend to go quiet at a certain point. Not tense quiet, not the silence that precedes a rupture, but the silence that comes when all parties in a room have arrived, approximately simultaneously, at an accurate accounting of the situation. The talk stops not because there is nothing left to say, but because there is nothing left to dispute. The room in that moment is not adversarial. It is simply a room where several people are sitting with a clear view of the same set of facts. This was that kind of silence. It took a few minutes to arrive at, but when it arrived, I recognized it, and I let it settle before I spoke again. The room went quiet. Outside, one of the atmospheric patrol warships moved steadily across the southern sky on its scheduled circuit. 6 kilometers of warship at 60 kilometers altitude, moving with the unhurried steadiness of something that has nowhere pressing to be, and nothing that can make it move faster than it has chosen to move. It was not there for the proceeding. Its circuit happened to cross the line of sight from the reception chamber at this hour of the morning, as it did every morning. I had not arranged this. It was simply the way things were, the way everything in the Sol system was arranged, not for display, but because it was on the schedule, because the schedule had been maintained, because maintaining the schedule was itself the point. I let him look at it. The silence that followed was the longest of the proceeding. Soten Rall sat with the condensed package open in front of him and did not read and did not speak. He looked at the warship's track across the southern sky. He looked at the orbital ring. He looked at the defense stations in their steady geosynchronous positions. He looked at the sprawl, 60 kilometers of megacity visible from where he was sitting, 300 generations of accumulated human determination built into its streets and towers, and the infrastructure extending above them into the space above the atmosphere. I have sat across tables from many delegations over the course of my career, and I have learned to read the quality of silences. This one was the silence of a party accepting a new framework for a situation they had entered with the wrong one. Not broken, simply revising the way a careful person revises when the evidence has become sufficient. I have seen it before, though never in a proceeding of this magnitude, and never in a party that had so far to revise from. I did not speak. Fenwick did not speak. We had prepared for long enough that we could give the moment whatever time it needed. When Soten Rall finally looked at me, his voice had changed in the way voices change when the mind behind them has shifted from one framework to another. "You prepared for this," he said. "Not accusation, not question. The recognition of a fact that changes the shape of everything that came before it. For 9 centuries, formally, I said, informally, for considerably longer. The Accord's text was preserved in human archives from the time of your departure. The orbital period was known. The return window was estimated within a range of decades. The Bureau was founded 900 years ago specifically to have a ready answer when the window arrived. 9 centuries of people working on a document that none of them expected to be the one to deliver. And yet you never broadcast a dissolution notice, he said. You never transmitted it into open space. There was no one to transmit it to, I said. The provision does not require broadcast. It requires deposit in recognized archives and maintenance of supporting documentation. Both were done. But if you are asking why we did not make a broader announcement to the galaxy, I paused, because I wanted the answer to be accurate and not merely pointed. Because it was our business. The dissolution of an instrument that had bound us was our business to handle in our own way, in our own time. We do not owe this galaxy a performance of our sovereignty. We exercised it, we did the work, deposited it, and waited for the morning when it would be needed. His legal attaché said something quietly in their language. Soten Ral listened and was still for a moment. The 4th section of your document, he said. The appendix, my attaché has read it. Yes, I said. It is a historical accounting of the compliance extractions. It is documentation, I said. The Bureau compiled it because it belongs in the record, not as a legal claim in this proceeding, not as a demand for any specific remedy, which is a separate matter we are not raising today. As documentation, because we maintain records, and the record of what the Accord's active enforcement took from this world, centuries, it was enforced, is part of that record. We chose to ensure that you receive it so that you leave this proceeding knowing that the record exists, that it has been assembled and sourced and archived in the same locations as the dissolution instrument, and that we have not forgotten any of it. We are not asking you to answer for it this morning. We are asking you to know that it is written down. He absorbed that, his expression, across the length of the table, had continued its quiet movement away from the composed authority of a senior enforcement official, conducting a familiar procedure. Not defeat in any simple sense. Something more like what I observe in a person who has arrived somewhere expecting one landscape, found another, and is choosing to actually look at the landscape rather than insisting the map they brought must be correct. It is, in my experience, a rare thing, the willingness to revise rather than insist, to look at what is actually there. Your intention in hosting this proceeding, Soten Ral said slowly, constructing the sentence in standard with care, is to formally close the instrument in your records. Yes, I said. We would like your delegation to sign the acknowledgement of dissolution. It is the last page of the condensed package. It requires only that you attest that you received the Bureau's response, and that you represent, to the best of your knowledge and authority, the institutional successor to the compact that executed the original instrument. We are not asking you to admit liability under the historical accounting. We are not asking you to answer this morning for anything beyond the acknowledgement itself. We are asking you to close the file with us, so that the dissolution is recorded on all sides and the instrument is fully closed in all relevant archives. And if we do not sign, he said, not a threat, a question about the landscape, one more piece of information about where he actually was standing, then the dissolution remains legally effective regardless, Fenwick said, with the same level factual tone he had maintained throughout. Article 22's dissolution is not contingent on the other party's acknowledgement. What changes with your signature is the completeness of the record. We prefer complete records. But we cannot require the signature, and we would not attempt to. The silence that followed was shorter than the previous one. He reached for the document. He turned to the last page and read the acknowledgement clause twice, deliberately, all the way through both times. Then he looked out the window a final time. The orbital ring, the defense stations in their steady positions, the warship completing its circuit to the south, the sprawl extending to the horizon, 60 kilometers of it readable from this height as the settled, accumulated answer to a question raised 120,000 years before that morning about what this world was going to become. Then he signed. I watched him set the pen down. I have been present at treaty signings before. The formal end of disputes, the closing of negotiations, the acknowledgement of agreed terms. And there is usually something in the room when it happens. Some shift of register, a release of held breath. People feel that a thing is done. This was different. The instrument being closed was not a dispute. It was not a negotiation. It was a legal proceeding, acknowledging a dissolution that had been in effect for 912 years. A formal record-keeping exercise for the benefit of the archive. The weight in the room when Soten Ral set the pen down was not the weight of a thing concluded. It was the weight of a thing finally caught up to. The dissolution had existed in the records for 9 centuries. What was happening now was simply that the party whose acknowledgement had been missing was finally adding it, completing a document that had been waiting patiently for its last signatory. Soten Ral looked at the document after he set the pen down. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they have just understood differently than they understood it before. Not the look that follows a defeat, but the look that follows a genuine revision of understanding. I have seen it before, and I respect it when I see it, because revision under pressure is harder than holding a position. And the people who can do it are the ones who make productive conversation possible. We will carry this record back to the directorate, he said. He was not speaking formally now. The compliance visit register was gone from his standard entirely. He was speaking as a person who has been in a room where something unexpected happened and is trying to find the right words for what he will say when he describes it to the people who sent him. We hope you will, I said. The record is complete. There is nothing in it that we have concealed or shaped for advantage. The dissolution is what it is, and the historical accounting is what it is. We hope the directorate finds the documentation useful. He nodded, which is a gesture his species does not typically use in formal contexts, and which I read as a further sign that the formal context had quietly ended some minutes before. Then he rose, and his delegation rose with him, and I rose, and Fenwick rose, and we stood in the room for a moment, in the particular way that people stand when a meeting is over, and no one quite knows how to leave it behind. His legal attaché witnessed. I signed for the Threshold Commission. Fenwick witnessed. I had a copy sealed and transferred to the Bureau's primary archive before the Compact's delegation had reached the corridor outside the reception chamber. Copies went to the 3 external archival locations within the hour. The file on the Verith Accord of Binding was closed on all sides for the first time in 120,000 years, witnessed and deposited and complete. The Compact's fleet departed. Over 3 days, they completed preparations and cleared the inner system. Our tracking stations confirmed the last vessel had cleared the heliopause on the evening of the 4th day. I was at the window on the 43rd tier, the same window where I had stood reading their transmission 4 days before, and I watched the orbital ring catch the last of the evening light and do the thing it does at certain times of year, where the station segments illuminate in sequence as the terminator rolls across them, a slow pulse moving around the curve of the planet, steady and patient and continuous, like something that has been going around for a very long time and expects to keep going. I thought about the Bureau's founders. The record is fragmentary about who they were and what was said in the meetings where the Bureau was established. What I know is that they made a decision 9 centuries ago to treat the Accord as a live instrument, to say, not if the Compact returns, but when. And when they do, we will have a ready answer. Not a scrambled improvisation, not a lucky miracle. 9 centuries of careful, unglamorous legal work, assembled into a document that was complete and final 61 years before I sat down to deliver it. And then they built the institution to hold that work across the centuries they would not themselves live to see, and their successors maintained it. 12 heads of bureau in unbroken succession, each receiving the file and the mandate, each adding to the documentation, refining the arguments, extending the archival deposits, none of them the person who would finally use it, all of them necessary for the person who did. And before the Bureau, the people who kept the Accord's text alive across the millennia before any institution existed to house it. Through the catastrophes that erase records, through wars and collapses, and the long, hard centuries when survival itself was not guaranteed. Through the entire arc of human history, from the era of the Accord's execution to the era of the orbital ring and the defense stations and the home fleet on its patrol circuits, someone always made sure the copy survived. Every generation in that chain made the same decision, in ordinary rooms without ceremony, without any guarantee that the decision would be vindicated in their lifetimes or their descendants' lifetimes. This document is worth preserving. This record is worth passing forward. Not because any person in the chain could be certain the moment would come, because they believed it might and decided that was sufficient reason to act on. I am the person who happened to be sitting at the table when the answer was delivered. I want to be careful not to mistake that for having built the answer. I received it from 12 heads of bureau before me, who received it from the bureau's founders, who received it from everyone who kept the text alive before any institution existed to maintain it. My role was to be worthy of what had been passed to me and to deliver it in a room where it counted. I hope I was. The ring finished its evening illumination cycle and settled into its nighttime register. The greater Verith sprawl filled the southern view with its own light. 300 generations of accumulated human determination built into its streets and towers and the infrastructure rising above them. In 60 kilometers of megacity, 900 generations of human lives were proceeding on their ordinary courses, largely unaware that a compliance fleet from a species most of them had never heard of had entered their system 4 days before, looked at what it found, and chosen to leave. That is how it should work. The answer should not have to be dramatic. The answer should simply be undeniable. Prepared long before the morning it is needed, completed before the morning it is needed, waiting in a sealed file in the Bureau's archival stacks for a morning that may or may not come in any given person's lifetime. The orbital ring, the defense stations, the home fleet on its scheduled circuits. 412 pages of careful, patient, century-by-century legal work, refined and re-refined and deposited and witnessed, ready before the fleet arrived and ready long after it left. That is what being ready actually means when you look at it from close enough. Not the warships, not the infrastructure, the decision to remember, to prepare, to hold the line of institutional memory across every catastrophe that tried to break it, to believe that the answer, when it was needed, should be already built, and to spend the time across centuries and generations and the ordinary, unglamorous work of people who would never know whether it mattered building it anyway. I went inside when the ring finished its cycle. I wrote my incident report for the commission chair, filed it, closed my terminal, and went to bed without ceremony. There was nothing left to do. The work had been done by the people who came before me, and it had held. We had been ready. I think about that phrase often, and about what it actually means in the context of a history that spans the kind of timescales this niche deals in. Readiness, in the ordinary sense, means being prepared for an event that is expected within a foreseeable time frame. You train for the mission before the mission begins. You stock the inventory before the demand arrives. Readiness of that kind is disciplined and valuable, and entirely inadequate for a problem measured in centuries. Readiness of that kind expires. People retire, institutional memory fades, priorities shift, the urgent crowds out the merely important. The compliance fleet that came back after 120,000 years was not counting on finding a ready Earth. They were counting reasonably on finding that no institution maintains readiness for 120,000 years. No institution does that, except the one we built specifically to do it. The Bureau's founders understood something that I think most institutions, in most circumstances, fail to understand. Readiness for the very long term is not a state, it is a practice. You cannot stock the inventory once and leave it. You cannot train for the mission and then retire the training cadre. You maintain the practice across time. You pass it forward. generation after generation, not as a set of conclusions, but as a living set of responsibilities. The Bureau's mandate was not to hold a finished answer. It was to hold a practice of preparation, a structure of institutional commitment across succession, after succession of people who would never personally face the morning the answer was needed. That structure, more than any specific legal argument the Bureau ever produced, was the thing that mattered. Without the structure, the arguments would have rotted in the archive, along with everything else that humanity has lost across 120,000 years of living. With the structure, they arrived in a reception chamber on a clear morning, sharp and current and complete, ready to be delivered to the people who came expecting to collect a debt from a world that had forgotten it owed one. We still are.